In March of 2012, I fulfilled a long goal by traveling to Europe to ski the Haute Route between Chamonix and Zermatt. In French, Haute Route means high route, and the Chamonix to Zermatt route was pioneered by British alpinists over 100 years ago. Originally, it was called the High Level Route, and the route travels from west to east through the Alps, linking the two great centers of alpinism. While there are many well-known ski traverses in the Alps, the Chamonix to Zermatt route is the most famous of them all. Every year, perhaps thousands of people ski the Haute Route in winter and hike it in the summer. There are several variations, but the most popular for skiers passes through the Swiss ski resort of Verbier, and this is the route that we followed. I think most avid skiers have heard of the Haute Route and have a vague familiarity with it. I probably first became aware of the trip through some mention in a ski magazine that I had read when I was a teenager. Over the years, I heard people speak about the Haute Route, but I never met anyone who had actually done it. About 6 years ago, I began ski touring and doing hut trips in the huts in central Colorado. Around this time, I also took a ski vacation to Austria and saw some of the mountain huts there. I began to research popular ski tours in the Alps, and of course I read a lot about the Haute Route. Several years ago, a friend and I began discussing doing the Haute Route in 2012 to mark our 40th birthdays. We were beginning to make our plans when unfortunately my friend had to make the decision that he would not be able to take the trip. By this time I was very interested in the Haute Route, and I began to look for another way to make the trip this year. I was looking for a group trip that I could join up with, and I contacted a mountain guiding company called On Top Mountaineering, based in Canada and owned by a German guide named Jörg Wiltz. My preference was to make the trip with a European guide rather than an American. There are not that many American mountain guides, and I wanted to experience the Haute Route with a European who was more familiar with the history, traditions, and customs of the Alps. Jörg's company turned out to be a good fit. His wife Heather is from Colorado and does the office work, and she was extremely helpful with making the trip arrangements. They had a couple other individuals interested in the Haute Route, and we scheduled the trip for mid-March. For our trip, Jörg had arranged for us to be led by a German guide and a friend of his named Uli Meyer. As the trip approached, one member of our group had to withdraw due to an injury, so there would just be two of us with the guide, myself and a Norwegian skier named Tor Hernes. I was excited to be making the trip, but also a bit anxious. I wasn't sure how well our group would fit together and get along. There was certainly some risk in signing up for such a big trip with strangers. But I put myself in the hands of fate. I expected to have a big adventure, but I never would have guessed that the trip would end up being one of the peak experiences of my life. I began by flying from my home in Colorado to Newark and then took an overnight flight to Geneva. From Geneva, I traveled by van service to Chamonix. I was surprised at how easy it is to get to Chamonix. I arrived in Geneva at around 7 a.m. and was at our hotel in Argentière, just up the valley from Chamonix, by 10 in the morning. It was a much easier trip than traveling from Denver to the big ski resorts in Colorado. Our hotel in Argentière, called the Hotel Couronne, is a fantastic old building, constructed in the 1800s and located right in the heart of the little village of Argentière. I got settled into a room with a fantastic view of the surrounding mountains. I had arrived in Argentière 2 days before we actually began the Haute Route. I immediately set about trying to overcome the jet lag by walking around Argentière and Chamonix. The weather was beautiful and the scenery is absolutely stunning, so I spent the day exploring the area. This panorama is of the incredible mountains surrounding the town of Chamonix. It's absolutely stunning. The highest mountain in Western Europe, Mont Blanc, rises above the town to over 15,000 feet in elevation. The village in Chamonix is around 4,000 feet, so to see Mont Blanc rising over 11,000 feet above the village is truly spectacular. There is no shortage of incredible scenery. The mountains are among the most dramatic you will find anywhere in the world. That evening I met Tor for dinner in the restaurant and bar across the street from our hotel. It was the first time that we had met. Beforehand we had only exchanged a few emails. Fortunately, we connected immediately, enjoyed a few beers and some good food, and made plans to ski together the next day. That next afternoon, we would meet our guide Uli, and we would begin the preparation for the Haute Route the following morning. That next morning, Tor and I met for breakfast in the hotel, and then we went up the Grand Monte ski area. The Grand Monte is one of the resorts located around Chamonix, and the base of the téléphérique or cable car at Grand Monte was only a short walk from our hotel. We skied for a couple of hours and then found this small hut on the edge of the ski area where we decided to stop in for a drink and a snack. The hut was a beautiful old stone building and is called the Refuge Lognon. We enjoyed a fantastic blueberry tart with some tea, and the food was so good that we made a reservation to come back later for lunch. After lunch, we spent the rest of the day skiing in great weather and getting to know each other better. That evening, Uli arrived at the hotel and we all shared a nice fondue dinner at the French restaurant next door, while we made plans to begin the Haute Route the following morning. The first day of our Haute Route involved taking the 2 cable cars up through the Grand Monte ski area, before we made a short descent down to the Argentière Glacier, and then climbed the Argentière Glacier on skis with climbing skins to the first hut, called the Refuge des Argentières. On the map you see the yellow lines represent the ski lifts that we used, the red lines climbs on skis or on foot, and the green lines the descents on skis. The yellow building symbol on the right of the map is the Refuge des Argentières. This is a photo of Uli getting geared up in the morning before we started. He is based in Garmisch, Germany, but he guides all over the Alps and is often on the road. He has this great van to carry all of his ski and climbing gear in, and to sleep in when necessary. Fortunately, he was able to leave it at our hotel for the week that we were on the Haute Route. We made the short walk from our hotel to the bottom of the téléphérique and got into the queue. Fortunately, the lines weren't bad, and we didn't wait long before we were on the exterior platform and saw the cable car coming down through some early morning fog. The weather was quite good, with blue sky above and a little bit of fog in the valley, but unfortunately higher up it was windy. Because of this wind, the second cable car up the mountain was closed. We took another chairlift as high as we could go within the ski area, and then we prepared to start climbing up on our skins. Here is Tor enjoying our morning climb. We started off on a groomed piste, but quickly we were off of this ski run and onto a small glacier. As we went up, the snow was polished by the wind and became very slippery. This required us to add ski crampons in addition to the climbing skins. I had never used ski crampons before, but they are absolutely fantastic for climbing on hard snow. It's very similar to the aluminum cleat on the bottom of a snowshoe, but it hangs off the sides of the skis. Of course, when we were partway up this first climb, the wind subsided and the cable car began to run again. But at this point we were near the top, so we continued on to the boundary of the ski area. This first climb of the day was about 1,300 vertical feet, and it went pretty quickly. We ducked under the rope and left the ski area to begin the descent down to the Argentière Glacier. I should explain that ski area boundaries are much different in Europe than in the United States, so we weren't breaking any law by ducking under the rope as we would have been in the U.S. The hut we're headed to for the night is at the upper end of this valley. The entire bottom of the valley is filled by the glacier. We had a nice descent of about 1,400 vertical feet down to the glacier. On the way we passed some beautiful seracs. Seracs are basically exposed ice sticking out above the snow. They can be as tall as cliffs and are prone to breaking off and falling down, so you steer clear of them when you can and you pass by quickly when you must travel beneath them. When we got down to the Argentière Glacier, we found a nice boulder on top of the snow, where we took a little break before beginning the final climb up the valley to the refuge. The mountains surrounding the Argentière Glacier are quite spectacular and are the location of some of the most challenging and famous climbing routes in the world. The guests at the hut are just as likely to be climbers as they are skiers, and I believe that on the night we stayed there were more climbers than there were skiers. The hut is on the side of the valley just above the glacier. We had only climbed another 700 vertical feet up to the hut, so we had just less than 2,000 feet of climbing for the day. But it still felt good to take the ski boots off, and we were happy to be at the hut. We enjoyed a nice dinner, and we were in bed by 8:30 in the evening to prepare for an early start the next morning. The huts in Europe are quite different than what we are used to in Colorado. There is a staff to take care of all the cleaning and cooking, and the food is flown in by helicopter. This allows you to carry a much lighter pack than we normally do here in the States. Breakfast and dinner are included with your stay, and you can purchase lunch as well. Dinner typically consists of 3 courses, usually beginning with soup, then a main course, and a small dessert. There was never any shortage of food at dinner. We spent a nice evening in the hut and then headed to bed. The next morning we were up at about 5:30 to begin day 2. From the refuge de Argentière, near the bottom of the map, we would travel over 2 cols, or passes, on our way to the Cabane du Triant, our next hut. We would also cross France into Switzerland during this day. This would be a pretty big day with quite a lot of climbing. Now everyone who knows me understands that I'm not much of a morning person, and I found the Euros, and especially the guides, to be extremely efficient in the morning. When Uli woke us up at about 5:30, he was already completely dressed, packed, and ready to ski. Here in this photo you can see Uli patiently, or maybe not so patiently, waiting for me to get all of my stuff together and get packed up in the morning. I was a real disaster this first morning, and I had gear spread out between our sleeping room and the gear room downstairs in the hut. I'm sure at this point Uli was wondering what he had gotten himself into with this unorganized American. Fortunately for me and for Uli, I got much better and more efficient as the trip went on. We had a small breakfast in the hut and then skied a little distance back down the glacier to the base of the climb up to the Col de Chardonnay. The Col de Chardonnay is up a side valley from the Argentière Glacier. This is a 2,500 vertical foot climb to a pass. Here we are putting the climbing skins on to begin climbing up to the Col de Chardonnay. The first part of the climb was steep and the snow was hard, so we soon had to take the skis off and begin to climb on foot. This was because the climbing skins won't grip on very hard icy snow, particularly when it's steep. Eventually we had to add boot crampons or spikes on the bottom of the ski boots due to the steep and icy snow. Unfortunately, the ice on the surface was a sun crust, and it wasn't always very strong, so much of the way we were post-holing up to our knees into the snow. It was a lot of work, and I was concerned that we would have these difficult conditions all the way to the top of this long climb. 2,500 feet of post-holing is a long, hard way to start the day. Fortunately, we had beautiful views back down to the Argentière Glacier and across the valley to the surrounding mountains. After about a half hour or so of climbing on foot, the slope became less steep and the snow was better, so we were able to begin climbing on skis again. It is much, much easier to climb on skis with skins than it is on foot. As we went up, we continued to enjoy spectacular scenery. The col or pass itself is in the center of this photo, and as we would soon discover, there is a dramatic descent down the other side. We reached the top after about 3 hours of climbing and looked down the couloir on the other side. The top of the couloir is almost 60 degrees in steepness. To put that in perspective, a typical double black diamond ski run in Colorado is about 40 degrees. 60 degrees is near the limit of what the most skilled extreme skiers in the world can ski down. So to descend this safely with clients, the guides set up a rope for belaying or lowering each skier down. Uli chose to have me descend first and explained that I would use what he called the German technique. The German technique is allowing the guide to lower you down the couloir backwards with your skis on. Essentially, you are skiing switch down a 60-degree couloir. It's really something pretty amazing. My inclination as a skier was to side slip rather than go backwards, but Uli explained that it was much easier for him to control the rope and our descent if we just slid straight down the couloir. So I put my life in his hands and let him start lowering me down the couloir. Unfortunately, a normal climbing rope is only about 50 meters or 150 feet long, and this couloir was well over that distance. So about 2/3 of the way down, I reached the literal end of my rope, and I had to unclip from the rope and then side slip the rest of the way. Fortunately, at that point the slope had flattened out, but it was still about 45 degrees, and it was quite a challenge to side slip down. The whole descent of the couloir was really something spectacular and probably one of the most thrilling things that I've ever done on skis. As soon as I reached the bottom, Uli began to lower Tor down behind me. You can see me standing down the slope if you look between Tor's legs. We were fortunate to be the first group of skiers to go over the col that morning. Uli told us that when there are a big crowd or a lot of skiers on the Haute Route, you can wait over an hour to be lowered down. I watched Tor descend down on the rope, and I was quite surprised to see that he never had to unclip from the rope. In fact, he got to use the rope until almost all the way to the very bottom of the couloir. I wondered if he had paid the guide more than I had, or if there was some other reason that he had gotten more rope to use than I had. When Tor got down to me, I learned that another guide and his client had arrived at the top of the col just as I was being lowered down, and afterwards the two guides had decided to tie their ropes together for the rest of the skiers to use. Tor and I were both pretty stoked to have come down this couloir, and I filmed a little interview with him about the experience.
Hero, you went down first to the end of the rope, eh?
Yeah, you got more rope than I did. The second guide helped you out. You owe him some money.
I did the luxurious version, just nice and cushy down there.
So,
Tommy's a great guy. If you're his wife watching this, hey man, great.
You're very kind, Tor.
Nothing like it.
So,
and then Uli will be joining us, I hope. Huh?
Yeah, hopefully, because I don't know where the hell we go next.
I hope they bring the rope.
So, how did you feel coming down?
It was nice and easy.
Yeah.
Just dangling down, and it was great.
I thought at first the going backwards was quite strange.
Yeah, but it's going down like normal rappel.
Yeah, I've never rappelled before, so.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's fun. And now we're down to the sun. We've been up to 3,006, yeah?
Yeah, we've done a lot of climbing.
3,600 meters.
Yeah.
Put that into feet, it's even more.
Yeah, it's I don't know, hours and hours of climbing. And now, and all in the shade, it's been quite cold.
Started at 6:30, something like that, and
yeah,
we walked in deep snow.
Yeah, we had the post hole, we call it.
10 kilo packs, emergency equipment, skis on the sack, feet sinking down into the snow, and I think we've done about anything today. We've done ski crampons, boot crampons, down rappel on skis.
Yeah, we definitely.
What can you ask?
We needed all the equipment today.
Yeah, everything.
Well, now we rest, and I think we get to ski downhill a little bit, which will be nice.
Well, do we deserve it?
Yeah.
Do we deserve it? And tonight I might even have some wine, vino.
I think I'm gonna have a beer tonight. Yeah.
In vino veritas.
Yeah.
Look at the tracks down there.
Yeah, I know, it looks good.
Yeah, we have one more call today though.
I think it's small.
300 meters.
Yeah.
Uli lowered the other guide, named Alphonse, and his client Claire down the couloir, and then he climbed down with crampons and an ice axe. Alphonse and Claire were also making the Haute Route, and from this point on we would all be traveling more or less together. We all ended up becoming quite good friends along the way. At the bottom of the couloir we skied onto the Glacier des Salines. We continued to enjoy fantastic scenery. We traversed across this glacier out of the shadows and into the sun, where we stopped for lunch. The Col du Chardonnay that we had just descended is straight behind Tor in this photo. After lunch we continued across this glacier and up towards the next pass that we would cross, called the Ventre de Salena. The weather was fantastic. We had no wind, and it was pretty warm, but not too hot. The climb up to this next pass was quite steep, far too steep for climbing on skis. So we put them on our backpacks and began climbing on foot. Fortunately, the sun-softened snow was very good for climbing, and it made for a very quick climb. And of course, the scenery surrounding us was fantastic. The climb was short, only about 600 vertical feet, and at the top we crossed through the rocks and onto the top of the next glacier, the Glacier du Trion. This is an incredibly expansive glacier. Not very steep, but huge. It covers an enormous area. We traversed across this glacier and then made a short climb up to the Cabane du Trion, the hut we would be staying at for the night. You can see the hut just above the cliffs toward the right side of this photo. This hut was a beautiful stone building, and we were the first group to arrive for the day. We had done a lot of climbing during the day, over 3,300 vertical feet, so we immediately enjoyed lunch and huge slices of pear cake on the excellent terrace outside the hut. The view from the terrace is outstanding, as you can see in this panorama. It's really impossible to convey the scale of the space that you're seeing in the photo, but it's just an enormous place. Here you can see an airplane with skis that was actually landing on the glacier below the hut. All afternoon we watched 3 or 4 ski planes practice landings and takeoffs on this glacier. I think this gives you a better sense of how big the glacier is. As the afternoon went on and the sun began to set, the view became better and better. Eventually we were treated to a spectacular sunset. That night there were only about 10 people total in the hut, which probably sleeps around 40. Our early March trip was right at the beginning of the ski touring season. In fact, most of the huts had just opened for the season a week before we arrived. The most popular time for the Haute Route is in mid-April due to more stable weather, but it was really nice to have uncrowded huts in March, and I would recommend to anyone that they do make the trip in March as well. Day 3 would cover a lot of distance, but would really be a pretty easy day. We woke up early at the Cabane du Trion, which is on the lower left of the map, and then we would make our way to the Cabane du Montfort, which is in the Verbier ski area on the upper right of the map. There would not be much climbing today, and we would use a taxi to make a transfer on our way to Verbier. Once we got to Verbier, we would use ski lifts to travel up through the ski resort and then ski down to the Cabane du Montfort. The blue line on this map shows the taxi segment that we used that day, and again the yellow lines are the ski lifts that we used. This morning I was getting with the swing of it, and I was up earlier and packed and ready to go. As a result of being a little more efficient, I got to enjoy an incredible sunrise outside the hut. The day would begin straight away with a descent through some nice snow on the glacier. Here's a little video that Uli shot of Alphonse, Claire, Tor, and I skiing down. It wasn't too steep, but it was sure a nice way to start the day. Eventually we skied down to a steeper part of the glacier and also into an area with a lot of crevasses. Crevasses are deep cracks that open in the glacier ice as a result of the movement of the glacier. They are a serious hazard that you must avoid, and the guides were cautious through this section, with Alphonse leading the way and Uli following the rest of us. We also passed by some more seracs in this area as well. Here I'm about to ski across a crevasse. In the winter, the snow drifts over the crevasses, forming snow bridges, but the bridges can break, so you want to cross them as quickly as possible. What you would do is ski down to the edge of the crevasse, then slide straight across the snow bridge as fast as you could, and then turn on the other side to slow down again. The one short climb on the day today was across from us in this photo. It's called the Col des Candies. It's the col in the center of the photo. It was only about 200 vertical feet, but it was quite steep. At the base of the climb, the guides decided that we should rope up. The climb on foot was not too difficult, but there were bad consequences if you fell. Uli went up first and then threw down a rope. We climbed two at a time on the rope, with Alphonse and Claire heading up first. Then Tor and I followed. Here you can see the steepness of the climb. Fortunately, we had good snow with no ice. And again, we had more nice scenery. Near the top of the col, we crossed from the cold shade that we had been in into the warm sun. And Tor and I really enjoyed being in the sun on a cold morning. On the other side of the col, we would make a very long descent down the Val des Arpets, down over 4,000 vertical feet, to a little ski area called Champex, where we would catch a taxi. We are headed all the way to the bottom of the valley behind Claire and Alphonse in this photo. We had pretty good skiing on the way down, with a mix of snow ranging from some nice powder and crud higher up to some refrozen spring snow down lower. And of course the scenery continued to be excellent. As we got lower down in the valley, we came onto a groomed road, or a catwalk, and we passed a few chalets that were shuttered up for the winter. We reached the paved road at a tiny single ski lift, just a little ski area beside the road with a parking lot for about 30 cars. There were no lift attendants or anything, and it accessed fantastic terrain. In the U.S., this place would be famous as an expert's mountain like Silverton or Arapahoe Basin, but here it's just another little local ski lift right beside the road. We waited a little while in the parking lot for the taxi. Sitting on the right of this photo is Roman, another person we would spend the remainder of the trip with. He arrived late in the evening the day before and had a gigantic backpack. He was also using a split snowboard. There was no guide with Roman. He's a young Russian kid from New Zealand and was making a long holiday, so he just decided to do the Haute Route. I'll have some more good stories about him later on. He had this huge backpack because he didn't know what to expect on the trip or what the huts would be like, but he quickly figured out that he was going to have to dump a lot of the gear if he thought he was going to make the rest of the trip. It was just too much weight to carry. While we were waiting for the taxi to arrive, we got to watch a helicopter picking up loads of supplies and food to take up to the huts. It's really nice to not have to carry all your food, like we do when we go on a hut trip in Colorado, and we could use some full-service huts like this in the United States. After our taxi ride, we arrived in a little town called Chablais, where we began taking ski lifts up into Verbier and on to our next hut, the Montfort hut. Although it looks quiet in this evening photo, when we arrived at around noon, the place was packed with skiers stopping for lunch. This place does an absolute killer business because it's located in the ski resort. But as the afternoon wore on, the skiers started to leave, and that evening we only had 9 people spending the night in the hut. We spent a nice afternoon in the sun and just enjoying the environment and the scenery. Here you can see some huge avalanches that had come down the week before and had run across some of the ski area. You'd never see avalanches like this in a ski area in the United States. The weather was again spectacular, and so were the views. We had a nice lunch, and then a few beers as the afternoon wore on, and as the evening came on, we were treated to another fantastic sunset. This hut was a little more luxurious than the others, and it even has hot showers, so everybody got to enjoy a nice hot shower. The hut has a large staff during the daytime, but only one guardian at night. And this night, there was a young American girl named Molly working at the hut. Her boyfriend's family owns the concession to operate the hut. Most of the huts themselves are owned by alpine clubs, but the actual business operation is privately owned and can be quite lucrative. The hut guardian gets to keep the money that they make off of the food sales. Many of the hut guardians are retired guides. With such a small number of guests in the hut, Molly offered to cook us whatever we would like for dinner. So we ordered a nice fondue. This ended up being a fantastic evening, as we enjoyed a nice leisurely meal together, spent the evening talking and listening to some classic French music that Tor had on his iPod. It was really probably the most memorable evening in the huts of the whole trip. After a pretty easy day on day 3, day 4 would include more work. We would head from the Cabane du Montfort, on the left of the map, to the Cabane du Proflerie. On the way we would cross a col and then summit a peak. We had to leave very early because after the first col we would cross, we would traverse some south-facing slopes that are prone to avalanching as the snow warms up in the sun. So the guides wanted to pass through this area before it got too warm. I woke up and was feeling a little bit off. I suspected that somewhere during the week I would have a slow day when fatigue would start to catch up to me, and today was going to be that day. We left the Cabane du Montfort behind and began the climb up to the Col de la Chaux, a climb of about 1,700 vertical feet. Although I wasn't feeling too good, I wasn't too slow. I just stayed at the back of the group and tried to follow along. As we climbed up to the Col de la Chaux, we passed a spectacular mountain called the Bec des Roses, which is where the Verbier Freeride ski contest is held. Once we got to the col, we came into the sun and then we prepared to descend down the other side. I wasn't feeling too bad, but I was definitely a half a step slower than I was the day before. This is a photo of the valley that we would descend down. There were spectacular mountains all around. And this is the view looking back up toward the Col de la Chaux after the descent. This photo is of a mountain called the Grand Combin, one of the most famous climbs in the Alps. We had good views of it through much of the day. After the descent, we began climbing, with our eventual destination being the summit of a peak called the Roses Blanches. We had perfect sunny weather, with no wind. It was warm but not too hot, and not warm enough to really melt the snow. Here is another view of the Bec des Roses. The Verbier Freeride contest uses the face on the right side of the mountain. The big south-facing couloir, looking directly at the camera, looked fantastic to ski. And if I ever get back to Verbier to ski, this will definitely be on my list of things to do. Each day as we traveled, we got closer and closer to Zermatt and closer to the Matterhorn. Here you can see the Matterhorn in the center of the photo. We were able to climb almost to the summit of the Roses Blanches on skis, but we had to make the final ascent on foot. Here you can see Uli and I about to begin that final climb. It's a pretty easy climb to the summit, but with a large cornice hanging off the left side with thousands of feet of exposure. The climb's quite popular because it makes for a good day tour from Verbier. From the top, we had incredible 360-degree views. And once we reached the summit, we joined Claire and Alphonse, who had been faster than us. Claire was an absolute climbing machine, and we joked with Alphonse about having her on the rope, for her safety, or was it for him to slow her down so that he could keep up? The area surrounding Verbier looks fantastic for ski touring, and it seems to offer unlimited possibilities. From the summit of the Roses Blanches, we would descend about 2,300 vertical feet to the next hut, called the Cabane de Profleury. At the top of the descent, we didn't suspect that we would have excellent powder skiing nearly the entire way down to the hut. Fortunately, I had begun to start feeling better as the day went on, and I was able to fully enjoy the powder skiing. This was some of the best snow that I had skied all winter. Uli shot some video of Tor and I skiing powder near the top of the descent.
Outstanding.
This was at the bottom of the second pitch of skiing, and there would be several more to come before we reached the hut. One of the last sections was about 40 degrees in steepness and had great powder. It was absolutely perfect conditions for powder skiing. The Cabane de Profleury is in a narrow valley, and it feels quite isolated despite being very close to the Verbier resort. All around the hut, there's fantastic terrain for skiing. We were the first groups to arrive at the hut for the day, and we would make the most of the remaining afternoon by sitting on the excellent patio in the sun. But first, a big lunch was in order. We shared a salad, a croûte au fromage, a roastie, and of course some beer and wine. This hut was also the first one we were at that had a resident dog. This dog would chase snowballs as long as you would keep throwing them. Later in the evening, another guide arrived with 3 Americans. A guy and his 2 20-something-year-old daughters. They were from Seattle. At dinner, the girls were asking Roman, the Russian Kiwi, where he was from. He asked them to guess where he was from, and the younger girl replied, "I don't know, but you kind of sound like one of the hobbits." This brought a huge round of laughter from everybody, and from then on Roman was referred to as the Hobbit. It was actually quite a fitting name because he usually was well behind us on the trail, the splitboard being much slower than skis. And we would often look back wondering where he was, but eventually he would pop up into view again. Day 5 would be our biggest day of the trip. We would leave the Cabane de Profleury near the top of the map, cross a col, traverse around a large reservoir or lake, and climb to the Cabane de Dix. If our energy allowed, we would also ski a peak near the Cabane de Dix. Again, we had to start very early in the morning in order to avoid some avalanche-prone slopes. We started climbing before sunrise up to the Col de Roue, about 600 vertical feet of climbing. Fortunately, today I was feeling very good again, and I was really able to enjoy this morning climb. At the top of the col, we prepared to begin descending and traversing around the lake. Our hope was to make it all the way to the far end of the lake without having to use the climbing skins. Along the way around the lake, we crossed a very large avalanche that had run sometime, probably several days before we came past. This was exactly why we needed to travel through this area in the morning before the sun warmed the snow up. This was a very large and destructive avalanche, and it had a lot of torn up earth and rocks contained within the snow and the avalanche debris. It prompted Uli to say that if you were caught in this one, you didn't need an avalanche beacon, you needed a priest. Fortunately, in the morning we had nice frozen snow, and therefore there was no avalanche hazard when we passed through this area. Further on, we came to an interesting snow condition, and somewhat hazardous skiing as we neared the far end of the lake. Because the water level in the reservoir is constantly drawn down through the winter, the broken ice that forms on the water lays in sheets left behind on the bank of the lake. Our route took us down over this broken ice. It was the strangest snow condition I had ever skied on. Sometimes the cracks were narrow and you could ski straight across them. But other times the cracks were quite wide and you had to sidestep down and across. Fortunately, we made it down pretty quickly and without any incident. At the end of the lake, we began climbing up a pretty steep slope with some tough sugar-like snow conditions. The skins don't grip the sugar snow very well, and it made for some tough climbing. Fortunately, it didn't last for too long. And pretty soon we came back into the sun from being in the shade all morning. This is a look back at the frozen lake as we were climbing up. We continued climbing up, and eventually we came onto the Glacier des Chayons, which was a nice level climb for most of its way. We stopped for a little snack in the sun, and it was quite warm. Just another beautiful day. The final slope up to the Cabane de 10 was steep, and it was actually quite hot in the sun by this time. As usual, we enjoyed a nice lunch on the terrace at the hut. After refueling and resting a little, Uli and I decided to climb up to a peak called La Louette for a ski run back down. We weren't sure if we would make it all the way to the summit, but at least we would get high enough to have a nice ski run. Tor decided to stay at the hut and enjoy the beer on the terrace. So Uli and I left all of our unnecessary gear at the hut to lighten our packs, and we headed up. We reached the summit of La Louette in about 90 minutes, which was quite fast and surprising given that we had climbed about 2,000 vertical feet. As we got close to the top, a girl named Agnes, who worked in the hut, caught up to us while on her afternoon break. She said she needed to ski back down to the hut so that she wouldn't be late for work to get ready for dinner, but Uli talked her into going all the way to the summit with us by promising to smooth things over with her boss if she was late getting back. We enjoyed a great full-circle view from the summit and then began to ski down. On the descent, we had a mix of snow conditions ranging from some wind crust at the top to pretty good powder skiing as we got further down. And we still got back to the hut in time to enjoy another hour of sun on the terrace. This had been the biggest day ever for me, with about 5,000 feet of climbing. And it was good to rest in the sun a little bit and rehydrate. I was happy that I felt so good after having kind of an off day the day before. While we were sitting on the terrace, somewhat surprisingly, a French guide who Tor had known for many years arrived at the hut with his two clients. It was quite a reunion, and Tor was quite happy to see Christophe and his group of friends, our group of friends grew again with Christophe and his two clients. It seemed that each day our group was becoming a little bigger. The route for the next day starts with a big climb up the glacier in the center of this photo. It looked like it was going to be quite a bit of work. Eventually the sun started to go down, so we moved inside the hut. And everybody enjoyed a nice meal together. The Dies hut has excellent food, and this was another nice evening. We spent a lot of time talking, and it was interesting to talk with the guides about working in the mountains and spending time in the mountains and just really enjoying life. Day 6 would take us to the final hut, the Cabane de Vignette, which is on the lower right of the map. This day includes one big massive climb of over 2,800 vertical feet, and then a 2,000-foot descent down to the hut. The day broke with pretty nice weather again, although a few clouds were visible, and for several days the weather forecast had been telling us that today we would see a change. There had been a bigger crowd at this hut, maybe 35 people overnight, and it seemed like many of us were leaving at the same time in the morning. We started with a short descent from the hut and then stopped to put the climbing skins on. The climb up began easy, but would soon become quite steep. We passed more ice and more seracs, and we had a nice view of the Mont Blanc de Chillon. As we continued to climb, it became more overcast. I don't have any photos from the steep part of this climb because it was very hard. We were traveling up between two areas of crevasses, which made for a very steep track on the way up. Eventually, the climb leveled off, and we came to a big level or easier area where we got to relax a bit more. We headed across this level area towards another steeper part with a steep glacier climb. Although this section was quite steep, it was much wider, so we were able to make a nice long series of switchbacks. As we neared the top of this section, the weather began to come in. With wind and cloud, it became colder and it began to snow. At the top of this steeper section, we were in a full-on storm. Everybody regrouped. We all put on our extra clothes and our warm coats, and the guides got out their maps and their GPSs. The visibility was disappearing rapidly. I don't have many pictures of the remainder of this climb. The weather just didn't allow for it. The wind was howling, it was quite cold, and we were simply trying to move as quickly as we could before it got any worse. The climbing route took us up over the shoulder of a mountain called the Piña de Arola. Had the weather been good, we would have summited this mountain. When we crossed over the shoulder, we reached an elevation of about 12,250 feet, the high point for the trip, and then we began the descent. Fortunately, the visibility was starting to become a little better as we began to descend. It was a careful trip down. We had a glacier with a lot of crevasses and refrozen, sun-crusted snow. Basically, we were just following each other one by one, with Uli leading the way. Although the visibility got a little better, the weather was still quite poor. And it was a big relief to finally be able to see the Cabane de Vignette. The Vignette hut is located in a fantastic position, perched on the side of a cliff. It's really amazing, and you wonder how they built this hut. We were all quite happy to have reached the hut before noon, and before the weather became any worse. We got settled into the hut to endure a stormy afternoon. It was quite crowded when we arrived. There were a lot of day tourers who had stopped to have lunch and take shelter from the storm. We began discussing plans for the next day. The weather forecast was not good, and the final day to Zermatt was long and required good visibility to navigate down the final glacier. If the weather stayed bad or worsened, we wouldn't be able to go all the way to Zermatt, and we would have to escape down the valley to the nearest town, a place called Arola. There was a little break in the weather that afternoon, and that allowed the crowd to thin out. I was able to sneak outside and take a few pictures of the glacier and the seracs on the Piña de Arola above the hut. We had another nice lunch and spent a lot of time hanging around the hut, talking with each other and talking with the guides. The vignette hut is a big place and it sleeps 120 people. They have a large staff. The hut is constructed mostly of large stone blocks, and again, it's just amazing that they were able to build it. You wonder how they did it. When you come into the hut, you enter into a nice atrium with large glass windows where you store your gear. The large windows look out straight down over the cliffs. It's really a pretty amazing view. This is a bedroom in the vignette hut, and it's pretty typical of the bedrooms in most of the huts. This one's maybe a little smaller than some of the others. The vignette hut has a helipad just outside the dining room windows where the helicopters land to make deliveries. During the afternoon we were there, we got a close-up view of a helicopter landing to drop off some staff. As the pilot took off, he hovered just above the helipad, moved off the edge sideways, and then dove down the side of the cliff below the hut. It was really a pretty spectacular takeoff, and I think he was showing off for all of the people that were looking out the windows from the hut. The use of the helicopters and the skill of the pilots in the Alps is really amazing. That afternoon, a couple other skiers, Peter and Astrid, who would be skiing with Uli the following week, joined up with us. We all enjoyed a nice dinner together and made plans to wake up very early the next morning to assess the weather and decide what route we would take. When we woke on day 7, it was dark, but you could hear and sense that the storm was still raging outside. We made the decision to retreat down to Arola rather than continue on to Zermatt. It would simply be too risky to try for Zermatt. After a fantastic week with great weather, no one was disappointed at having to retreat on the final day. We enjoyed a somewhat leisurely breakfast and then went out into the storm to ski down to Arola. The descent was pretty straightforward, and near the bottom we skied onto the groomed runs at the little Arola ski area. When we finally got to the road, Tor, Roman, and I were quite happy to have finished such a great week together. We waited about 30 minutes for our taxi to arrive. The weather in the valley was better, but you could see it was really storming up in the mountains. Our taxi was a big 15-passenger Mercedes van. The driver must have dreamed of being a Formula One racer. It was really incredible to see how he drove that big van over the narrow mountain roads on the way to Chamonix. The trip took a couple of hours. But by noon we were back in Chamonix and enjoying beer and lunch on the patio at the restaurant next to the hotel. The weather here was still pretty good, but it soon began snowing hard, and it stormed all afternoon and all night as well. For our final evening together, we enjoyed a nice dinner of French food, and in the morning we met for breakfast and sadly said our goodbyes. At the start, I knew that the Haute Route was going to be a big experience, a real adventure. But it ended up being far more than I ever could have imagined. The skiing in the mountains and the huts were fantastic, but the best part of the trip by far was the most wonderful people that I met and shared the experience with. I couldn't have had a better companion for the trip than Tor, and I can't imagine a better guide than Uli. They became my great friends, and I really want to do another ski tour with them both sometime again in the future. I have to make many thanks to On Top Mountaineering for arranging the trip, and to Uli Meyer for being our excellent mountain guide. The trip really was one of the best experiences I've ever had, and I feel so fortunate to have made it. I wanted to make this video as a way to share the trip with my friends and my family, but mostly as a way to help me always remember this incredible experience.